Hey everybody, my name is Ayrton King and I look after the corals here at the aquarium. And as you've already seen in the culture lab, all the plankton and phytoplankton, zooplankton that we make up there. Now I'm going to tell you and show you a little bit about how we use that here in the coral exhibit. So if you think about corals and their body structure, corals are made up of all these small little polyp structures, and basically the simplest way I can put it is a polyp looks very similar to like a small anemone. And that's why corals and anemones and our jellyfish, they're all grouped in one family called cnidarians. And that's because they all have a very simple body structure that looks like a small anemone. So it's got a little mouth and there's lots of tentacles. And with our larger coral colonies, they're made up of tiny little polyps. So if you think of an apartment block with lots of little windows, I like to think of our corals as the same structure. It's basically this large structure that has all these little polyps that form this one colony or one animal. And those polyps are all working together to catch food and also distribute food amongst the animal and the colony itself. So with the little polyps, they've got little stinging tentacles, and they'll catch the plankton out of the water column as it's drifting past them. Some corals are able to adapt to their environment and move and actually go and locate food, whereas a lot of the other corals, they stationary on a rock or a outcrop, and they have to rely on the food that's drifting on by. So they really rely on their little tentacles to catch those food particles. Yeah, in the aquarium, it's a very different environment. It's not like the ocean outside. So with me, yeah, I've got some Artemia. So you can see the jug kind of looks a little bit like dusty water. All the little dust particles are the tiny little brine shrimp. And this is grown in our culture lab upstairs. We are also going to feed them some green water. And this is basically a form of phytoplankton. So it just looks like dirty algae water. And then we also have rotifers, which is another form of zooplankton like Artemia, but it's a lot smaller. So we simply pour, we call it like a saturation feed from the surface. We're pouring the food in from the top, and that then gets mixed into the water column, and we've got lots of pumps that provide the corals with different flow and different currents, and that will then pass the food through the system where all the corals can get enough food. Not all of our corals though are able to catch food as well as the others. So what we then do in those cases, like for our sunburst corals, is we actually directly target feed them. So we use a turkey baster and we get a mixture of food and we suck it up with the turkey baster, and then we target feed them. So we're using that turkey baster to basically spray the food directly into the little polyp's mouth. And that just ensures that our corals are getting enough food and that they're getting food consistently. If you think of corals and the water flow especially, yeah, because our coral exhibit is a closed system, it means that food is in the system for quite a long period of time. Whereas if it was an open system, basically it means that we're getting new incoming water in all the time, and that food can also be washed out a lot quicker than it would if it was on a closed system. If you think of the coral polyps, so some are actually very large, some are really small. So we've also got to cater for the different coral polyps and their size. And that's why we use a variety of different zooplankton. So we use Artemia. Artemia is a lot larger, for example, than rotifers. So our smaller corals that have smaller mouths, they can rather feed on the rotifers, whereas the larger corals, they can obviously eat the Artemia because their mouths are larger and their tentacles are able to catch that food more easily from the water column. When it comes to caring for our corals, there's multiple things we need to take into consideration. And one of the biggest things that we take into consideration with the coral exhibit is the flow and the currents that the water has in the exhibit. And that's not only to keep the corals happy, but also to help deliver the food to them. I like to think of it as like Uber Eats for the corals. And out in the wild, obviously, there isn't any wave makers or pumps. So what we have to rely on there, if you think of out in the ocean, is things like upwelling. So there's large changes in water movement, and that often brings up the nutrient-rich water from the bottom of the ocean, which will have all those nutrients in for a lot of our corals as well.
Hello, my name is Taygan. I'm an aquarist at the Two Oceans Aquarium. I am just going to be telling you a little bit more about our tube anemones today. So our tube anemones are filter feeders. We feed them a type of zooplankton known as Artemia, as you know, but they are grown in the culture lab. So I am going to use a little turkey baster today to try and target feed each tube anemone. So just gonna suck that up. And then push out the Artemia onto their tentacles. So normally I would just throw in this jug of Artemia as they use their tentacles that have stinging cells to capture the prey in the water column. But today I'm just going to be a little bit more different and do a different type of enrichment. And that'll just be target feeding each tube anemone. Another form of enrichment I try and do with our tube anemones is I feed them hay crow, also known as fish eggs. So our kitchen man mums will blend it up for me. I will freeze the blocks and dissolve them in a jug full of water. I will then use a turkey baster, suck up the hay crow, and then target feed each anemone that is open. So our tube anemones in the wild, they can also feed on crustaceans. They don't only feed on small microscopic animals like our Artemia. Their tentacles contain stinging cells called nematocysts. They use that to paralyze their prey. They will bring their Artemia or any other sort of prey that they've caught from their tentacles into their mouths, and that's how they will feed on animals within the water column. So they may look like they can only feed on small animals, but their looks are definitely deceiving.
So we're just busy feeding a smoothie now. And the smoothie is basically a way that we can fill in the gaps of our jellyfish's diet, because we primarily feed them something called Artemia. And Artemia can be made nutritious, but it's not as nutritious as the food the jellies would be eating in the ocean, which is normally copepods and other small animal plankton we refer to as zooplankton. So this is a way we can fill a gap in their diet. So this basically has anything you can think of on the seafood table. It has fish, normally fish with very little to no bones. It has hay crow, it has fish eggs. We put prawns in here. We've got lots of different frozen zooplanktons as well. And then sometimes we even put in Hill's AD that is utilized to help dogs and cats recover after surgery, just to make sure that it is as nutritionally dense as possible. Because when jellyfish are in the ocean, they basically stick to these slicks of currents that basically is a pretend McDonald's drive-through. So as long as the jellyfish are swimming in it, they're basically exposed to food. So the jellyfish are constantly eating all the time. And jellyfish stinging cells, we call them nematocysts. Those stinging cells actually have different stinging cells for different prey. So there are stinging cells for crustaceans, there's stinging cells for fish. And so getting all of those stinging cells to actually fire helps these jellyfish create similar stinging cells to what they would actually have in nature. Whereas if you feed a jellyfish a very monoculture diet, their stinging cells start to wane and basically become more of one type than the other, and so they mostly lose their stinging ability in captivity. But yet our aquarium, a lot of the times the jellyfish actually they retain their potent stinging ability because we feed them such a broad diet spectrum. And the jellies are fed between 5 to 8 times a day. They'll get a smoothie in the morning, which is what we're feeding right now. Most of the jellies will get target fed to ensure that they get the nutrition that they need in order to grow. And then we do broadcast feeds of Artemia and rotifers a minimum of 3 times a day. They can also get a second feed of smoothie. And then other jellies will get, if they eat jellyfish, they'll get jellyfish twice a day. And then other jellyfish will also get a mussel juice or a mussel smoothie also fed to them twice a day. That they will just filter out of the water column as well. So you can see as we are busy feeding the jellies, their tentacles retract. That's also how I know which ones I fed before. That's how I can keep track of who I fed, who I haven't fed, is by looking at the little tentacles. You'll also see that there'll be a white fringe that forms just because the smoothie color is kind of whitish. So that's how I know that that jellyfish was also retaining and keeping the food that it needs. After that food is eaten, a second or a third or a fourth pulse will deliver that food to the jellyfish's oral arms or lips in the center of the jellyfish. And jellies are radially symmetrical, which means they kind of, how can I say, assemble around a exact point. And so if you cut a jellyfish in half, in theory, the exact same other half is on the opposite side. So moon jellyfish normally have 4 sets of gonads in their stomachs, and you can see it looks like 4 horseshoes or like a little clove or flower pattern. And these jellyfish actually prioritize the food to make sperm and eggs, gametes, so they can reproduce before they actually put any energy into growth in the first place. So if we don't feed the jellyfish really well, they won't develop and grow. And we have jellyfish of multiple different ages in this exhibit, just because we have figured out the exact temperature for the species to live. So normally jellies live about 9 months, but we can keep them going for a year and a half or longer sometimes. And so as individuals expire, we move them off exhibit, and then we just move newer animals on exhibit. So the animals in the tanks aren't necessarily smaller because they're not getting the same nutrition. They're necessarily smaller because they are younger than other jellyfish in that exhibit at that present time, basically. The ocean is incredibly productive and it's very important. One of the greatest things the ocean does is something called diurnal migration. And so everybody gets really excited for this concept and this idea that there are wildebeest on the African plains. As it rains, the grass grows, the wildebeest run, they graze, and the predators follow them, and they go in this big, massive circle all along the middle part of the continent. But in the ocean, that happens every day, twice a day, most of the time. We call it diurnal migration. So billions and billions and billions and billions of plankton all around the world, when the sun comes up, the photosynthetic organisms swim towards the surface, they start to photosynthesize, and then the animal plankton, we call them zooplankton, they swim after this phytoplankton because they are grazers, and they consume all of this phytoplankton, and then the other larger animals, whether it be baby fish, crabs, jellyfish, consume that plankton, and then larger fish like tuna or striped bonitos and sharks and dolphins eat those organisms again, and as they defecate, that nutrients goes to the bottom of the ocean. And then later on, when season changes happen, there are processes in the ocean that pulls up that nutrients and injects it back into the water column for that phytoplankton to use as fertilizer. So that process happens constantly. But every morning, all of this plankton comes to the surface, and in the evening, in order to avoid predators, all of that plankton migrates into the darkness of the sea again so that they don't get consumed by predators as well. So that happens often. And so one of the coolest things is when you go on a boat again, look on top of the water and you'll see there looks like there are little roads in the water on the sea. We call them slicks. And in those slicks, that's actually a very good ocean stream that actually carries food, and it carries the plankton as well. So we can find lots of jellyfish in that. And so that's why earlier I referred to it being like a McDonald's drive-through, because as this current is carrying those jellyfish around with their little umbrella shapes perfectly created to catch the current and basically move along with it, as those jellyfish are pulsing, they're essentially catching and stinging their food with their tentacles and then flicking it onto their lips for them to ingest with their lips into their mouths and digest the food again. So they're constantly swimming in this drive-through where they can eat and consume. We have this fantastic area, especially on the west coast, where a lot of upwelling happens. And upwelling is just this process where the wind blows parallel to the coastline, and that basically allows a lot of nutrient-rich water from the bottom of the ocean to actually pull to the surface. And most of the time, because the water at the bottom of the ocean is quite cold, that cold water gets injected into the water column, and the water becomes really cold. And that's why, counter to how our brains work, our water is actually much colder in summer than it is in winter, because most of our upwelling actually happens in summer. So that cold nutrient-rich water gets pulled up into the water column, which is fantastic because during summer we've got the longest period of daytime, and so lots of phytoplankton can reproduce using up all of that nutrients, and so that makes the Benguela ecosystem one of the most productive ecosystems in the world compared to any other ecosystem. That productive ecosystem supports so many predators and so many fisheries along our coastline that it allows for lots of animals to actually multiply and reproduce and spill over to other parts of our coastline. So our coastline is only about 2,300 kilometers long, but just like on land, we've got one of the highest diversity in the world. And this mixing of the Indian Ocean and the warm Agulhas current and the cold Benguela current actually pulls and pushes and creates these temperate zones, sometimes further up the coast during certain periods of time and lower down the coast during other periods of time, creating all these little micro zones where animals can start fulfilling and living in their own niches and start speciating and filling those niches where other animals can't fall, because either they can adapt to both cold and warm, or they're just restricted to being warm. And that allows for a lot of adaptability and a lot of diversity. And that also allows for many zones where animals actually don't adapt because they don't have to, because those little climates actually stay exactly the same for long periods of time, which aids in how many animals have developed over time to take advantage of those little climates and zones where only they can occur in. So what's quite cool is at the aquarium, I think it's quite amazing, because even if you go out on the best diving day, you'll never ever get to see any of the diversity that's on our coastline under this one place. You'll see species that you wouldn't have seen if you go out on this day or that day or the other, because we just have that collection, and those animals at this aquarium most of the time is found nowhere else in the world. And so you can literally guarantee yourself, if you come visit Torsh's aquarium, you would have seen something that you wouldn't have seen at any other aquarium anywhere else.